All right, so it's been a few days since the last filmed portion of this video. In fact, it is an entirely new season now, and it's getting kind of cold, hence my long pants. But what we're getting ready to do is get this engine down into my test subframe here. This is actually just an old subframe that was donated to me by the Gentleman's Motor Racing team. If you haven't seen his channel, you should check it out. It's very, very good. And he donated this to me, shipped it all the way from England over here, and I welded it to a steel frame, and this is my engine test stand. Now there's still a few modifications that we need to do with this because I initially built it for my Bad Wolf engine, but with logistics and everything, it just made more sense for me to actually run that in the car. The next thing we need to do, essentially, is get this off of my engine stand down into my engine test stand, and then weld on a few additional stabilizing brackets and things to make sure that this is really safe. So, without further ado, let's get into this and start moving this around.
Brought to you by Gertie Beats. Brought to you by Gertie Beats.
All right, so there we have it. The engine is in the stand. There are definitely some improvements to the stand that I think I can make. Namely, I think the holes for the engine mounts need to be a little bit larger. When you're kind of finagling it underneath and getting it down into the stand, it makes it really, really difficult because you can't fully like maneuver it the way you want it to. Now, I think I'm gonna go ahead and leave this cover on for right now. This is just to protect the ports and keep things from getting inside it. We are also gonna have to put the cover back on the rocker cover here. Gonna have to get the starter on. Lots of things left to do, but let's go ahead and start mocking some things up and getting some more bracketry added on here. Should be a lot of fun. All right, so we've jumped ahead a few days here and we've got most of the engine stand wired up. Now, I was gonna show you guys how I did this and kind of like one by one how I assembled all of this. However, when I was building this, I kind of did it more like stream of consciousness, where you just kind of like start adding things on and experience it at the time. So I didn't record most of it, but let's go over what I've done so you guys can get an idea of how this is gonna work for you. So before I go into the wiring itself, I do wanna mention that this engine stand is not about running the engine in or really putting load on the engine. The goal of this is to verify that there are no leaks with this engine, so fill it up with oil, verify oil pressure, and then we're gonna start it up and make sure that it spins over, it runs relatively nicely. But the true load test for this engine is not gonna be until it's in the car and it's on a dyno. To get the rings really where they need to be and to like actually bed them in with the block, all of the machine work that's been done on the block, we really need a load on this, which means you need resistance on the engine so that it's actually pushing and creating power instead of just idling in place. Now, when I did the Haltech ECU on my Mini, I actually was left with a premium harness fuse block and relay panel. So I went ahead and repurposed that for this engine stand, and I went ahead and used that to make sure that I had full safety measures on this engine stand and it wasn't just a few 12-volt wires flopping all over the place. So it may look a little messy and like, you know, what's going on here, but let's go one by one on what's happening. We've got a small 12-volt battery down here, and I have a permanent ground wire wired to the chassis of the engine stand. I've got it grounded on the body of the engine as well, and then I have it grounded into my fuse block. Now, all of these grounds collect on the negative terminal of this battery, and then I have a single positive feed that goes to a battery switch cutoff. This is my primary safety mechanism. This is where if things are starting to go terribly wrong and I absolutely just need to cut power to everything on the engine, then I can just turn that switch on or off to deliver energy and power to that fuse block, as well as the starter and all the other things in here. Now, right next to that, you'll see that there is a starter solenoid. This is unusual when paired with an inertia starter. With a early starter like this, you used to have a floor start button. Obviously, we have no floor and we have no floor start button. So instead, we opted to put a starter solenoid in there, which is basically a fancy relay. Now, the button for that starter solenoid is up at the top of the engine stand. It's this big rubber button here, and that is going to provide you the ability to start the engine right from your control center, as it were. I went back and forth on how many buttons and how many switches I was gonna have on this, but ultimately, there are only two electrical devices that we're gonna be turning on for this engine, and that is the ignition coil and the fuel pump. Now, I have a standard SU fuel pump sitting right down at the bottom of the frame there, and I have it up front so I can see if there are any leaks when I am running that. But that switch will turn on both the pump and the ignition coil to provide power to my engine stand. Now, between those two, that's effectively all the electrical that's on this engine. The rest of the gauges and things that are actually sitting up here at this control center are pretty static. So we have a 12-volt gauge here. This is gonna just give us that indication of what our power levels are at any given time. An oil pressure gauge. This is a mechanical gauge, so it requires no electrical signal, and that goes right into the block to generate our oil pressure. And then finally, our water temperature gauge. Now, we may not end up using that one in this build. I do have it wired in, but depending on if we run this engine here or how we run the engine, that'll determine whether or not we actually use it in this case. So that covers the kind of primary setup here. I haven't plumbed in the radiator yet because I'm waiting for a few hoses. But to start off, let's spin the engine over. Let's fill it up with oil and spin the engine over and see if we get some good oil pressure. This is something that I strongly recommend anybody do. You can do this while the engine's sitting on the ground, technically, but you'll want to strap it down to be safe. And this is to verify, you don't have any issues with oil pressure before the engine goes off and either goes into your car or off to a customer. Now, something cool that this engine has is a factory oil cooler with a factory oil cooler bracket that I've never seen this before. It's really, really unusual, but it sits right down on the right side of the engine block and kind of mounts to the filter housing as well as the bottom of the gearbox. So very, very cool setup. But yeah, let's get some oil in this. All right, and with that done, what we're gonna do is go ahead and unplug our ignition coil as well. We don't need any sort of power running to that. Also, we have a switch here that does that too, but just extra safety. And let's go ahead and start spinning this over. It's gonna get a little loud here, but let's see how it does. So that was a great result. We got up to about 70 PSI on the oil pressure gauge here, and we only had one leak, and it's just this one little special non-standard spot here. This is an oil pressure sensor, and I think there is supposed to be a little gasket in here, which I don't know that they sell anymore, so we're probably gonna have to use some sort of liquid sealant here. I wasn't sure if we needed to or not, and this has confirmed that for me. So this will come back off, this little unit here. We'll get that cleaned up, but with that, the engine is ready to come off of the stand. All right, so that wraps up the engine test on this bench here. I did want to run it on this stand, and I might have actually done it if it had been my personal engine. However, I talked to quite a few different machine shops. I talked to a few engine builders in the UK, and they suggested and encouraged me not to run this engine on the stand for a few reasons. First off is that you don't actually get a proper load on the engine. Now, you could do something like bed in the camshaft, but you can't really put a true load on it, and you run the risk of not setting in and not bedding in your piston rings properly. So with this engine, I really want this to be an absolute awesome, strong, fast, really reliable engine. And I want every piece of the run-in process to be done as close to perfect as possible. So we're gonna wait, we're not gonna run the engine on the stand, and I'm gonna hand this back off to the owner, officially say goodbye to the Cooper S engine, and I'll send it off to be put back in his car when it's ready for an engine to go back in. Now, don't worry, I can't possibly send this engine off and home without doing a few glamour shots, so let's get those out of the way, and you guys can see all of the engine in its full glory and its fully assembled state before it goes back to its wonderful owner. Now, if you guys have any questions about this episode, I know it was kind of disjointed because it was filmed over quite a long period of time. But if you have any questions about the engine, see anything you have any suggestions about or want to know more about, feel free to post those in the comment section below. And I am really looking forward to what's coming up next on the channel, so stay tuned for that. I've got lots of really cool stuff in store. And if you haven't already, maybe consider subscribing. And if you like this video, consider hitting the like button, although you don't have to. But I think that's gonna wrap this episode up. So I really appreciate you guys joining in today. And until I see you guys again, you know the drill. Enjoy those minis and motor on.